Welcome in, everyone, to this deep dive we're doing today. And today it's all about the aftermath of the January 2025 wildfires here in California. And we're really focusing on, zeroing in on the Hurst and Eaton fires in LA County. And you've given us a ton of material to go over. News articles, reports, firsthand accounts even. I gotta say, some of this stuff is really perplexing.
Yeah, it's complicated for sure.
Yeah.
You have two fires that ignite almost at the same time, both with these potential connections to SoCal Edison. You've got explosions caught on camera, residents on edge about living near these high voltage power lines. There's a lot of questions here surrounding SoCal Edison's role.
Yeah. Okay, so let's set the scene a little bit. It's January 7th, 2025. Conditions are just ripe for disaster. We're talking strong Santa Ana winds. The vegetation is bone dry. And then, boom, 3 major fires break out practically at the same time. The Hurst Fire, the Eaton Fire, and the Palisades Fire. 29 deaths. Thousands of homes are destroyed. It was just devastating. The Palisades Fire, it was massive. Over 23,000 acres burned.
But the Hurst and the Eaton fires are the ones we're really going to be focusing on today because their origins are still under investigation.
Yeah.
There's just a ton of controversy swirling around these two in particular.
Yeah. And, speaking of controversy, let's start with the Hurst Fire. So Cal Edison actually came out and admitted that their equipment probably started this one. They filed a report with state regulators on February 6th, basically saying, yeah, this one's on us.
Right. And that report points to an exploding transformer tower, probably caused by those high winds we were talking about, as the ignition source. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So Cal Edison's CEO, Pedro Pizarro, actually mentioned that residents had reported the fire at 10 p.m. But their systems didn't show any sign of a spark on the power lines until 10 p.m.
Wait, hold on. I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that. So their equipment starts a fire a full minute before there's any indication of an electrical problem. What are the odds of that?
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. And that discrepancy has sparked a lot of debate, understandably. Some experts believe that a malfunction in the equipment could have gone undetected initially. Others are speculating that there might be a completely different, unidentified factor at play here.
Yeah, it does feel like there are more questions than answers right now. At least, thankfully, the Hurst Fire didn't result in any deaths or destroy any homes. It burned about 800 acres near Sylmar before it was contained.
It's interesting, though. That area is actually really prone to fires. It actually burned pretty near the Oak Ridge Mobile Home Park, which was also in the path of the Saddle Ridge Fire back in 2019. And that was another fire that started under a transmission tower. So it kind of raises some questions about whether SoCal Edison really took, adequate preventative measures in a known high-risk area.
Okay, so let's move on to the Eaton Fire now. This one is complicated. SoCal Edison is currently investigating their possible involvement, but they're officially denying any responsibility.
Right. Their current theory is that an idle transmission line somehow became energized. So essentially a nearby energized line could have induced a current in the idle one through a phenomenon called induced voltage. If that induced current is strong enough, it could cause a spark and ignite a fire.
Induced voltage. So you're saying even a line that's not actively carrying electricity could still pose a fire risk? That's kind of unsettling.
It is. It's a lesser-known risk for sure, but it highlights just how complex these systems are and how many potential points of failure there really are. And despite their denials, multiple lawsuits have actually been filed against SoCal Edison by victims of the Eaton Fire.
Yeah, and I can understand why. The Eaton Fire was just utterly devastating. Tore through Altadena, claiming 17 lives. We're talking not just homes lost, but irreplaceable family heirlooms. Generational wealth wiped out in a matter of hours.
Yeah, and that's the real tragedy of it. The emotional and historical value lost in a fire like this is immeasurable. And it's something that often gets overlooked when we talk about, financial costs of these types of disasters.
You've brought up some great points. Really appreciate it. So we've been talking about the specifics of the Hurst and Eaton fires, but I'm also curious about the bigger picture here. It just seems like California is constantly battling these mega fires. Are we actually seeing a real increase in wildfire activity, or does it just feel that way because of, the news coverage and all that?
It's not just a feeling. There's definitely been a pretty dramatic increase in both the frequency and the intensity of wildfires in California, especially over the past few decades. It's complicated. There are a few key factors driving this trend. Climate change is a major one. Hotter temperatures, drier conditions, that all creates the perfect environment for these wildfires to spark and spread, like wildfires, basically. We're also seeing much longer fire seasons now, and even the smallest spark can turn into a raging inferno in these conditions.
Yeah. It's kind of terrifying, honestly. And then, I know there's been a lot of talk about how past forest management practices might actually be making things worse. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. For about a century, the main approach to forest management was fire suppression. So the idea was to just put out any fire as quickly as possible. But that actually ended up leading to a huge buildup of underbrush and dry vegetation. And so you might be surprised to learn that controlled burns, intentionally setting fires, are actually a vital tool for mitigating these large-scale wildfires.
Really?
Yeah, so by burning off some of that excess fuel in a controlled manner, you can actually reduce the risk of these massive, uncontrollable fires. It's kind of like cleaning up your yard before things get too overgrown.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And then,
Yeah.
you layer on top of all that the fact that more and more people are building homes in areas that are prone to wildfires.
Exactly. That's a huge factor. We call that the wildland-urban interface.
Yeah.
Basically where houses and wildland vegetation meet. And that makes those areas highly susceptible to fire spread. It's a growing concern because as more people move into those areas, the potential for wildfires to impact communities and cause damage, it just increases exponentially. We saw that really clearly with the Eaton Fire and the devastation in Altadena.
Right. So you've got climate change creating these, prime conditions for these fires to happen. You've got past fire suppression practices leading to this buildup of fuel. And then you've got more and more people living in harm's way. It's almost like, I don't know, a recipe for disaster or something.
Yeah, it's like a perfect storm in a way. And that's exactly why we need a multi-pronged approach to address this whole issue. Mitigation, prevention, adaptation, all of that needs to be part of the solution.
I mean, while I understand the need for, utility companies to keep costs down and all that, isn't it ultimately their responsibility to ensure the safety of their equipment, even if it means higher prices for consumers?
It's a complex issue, for sure. And that's definitely a valid concern. I mean, utility companies are dealing with aging infrastructure, vast networks of power lines to maintain.
Yeah.
And there's increasing pressure to keep energy costs affordable. But as we've seen with these recent fires, the consequences of failing to adequately address these risks, they're immense.
Yeah. And we're seeing those consequences play out right now with these January 2025 fires.
Absolutely. These fires should serve as a serious wake-up call for these utility companies. They need to start prioritizing safety and investing in the necessary measures to prevent future tragedies.
So, what does that look like in practice? What specific steps can they take to reduce this risk of their equipment starting these fires?
It's a combination of things. They need to accelerate the replacement of aging equipment, particularly in these high-risk fire zones. They also need to adopt more aggressive vegetation management programs. And they need to invest in new technologies, like weather monitoring systems and sensors that can detect potential faults in power lines.
Right. And this is going to require pretty significant financial investment, right?
It will, yes. But it's an investment that's essential to protect lives, property, and the environment. The cost of prevention is always going to be far less than the cost of dealing with the aftermath of a major wildfire.
I think that's a really important point. And it's not even just about the financial cost. It's about the human cost as well. Those 29 lives that were lost in those January fires, the countless families that were displaced from their homes, those are the real consequences of inaction.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. These fires highlight just how devastating the impact of these wildfires can be on individuals, on families, on entire communities. The trauma, the loss, the disruption, it's something that people carry with them for years, even decades.
And these fires also, they raise questions about who's ultimately responsible for preventing these types of disasters. Is it solely on these utility companies? Or do communities and individuals have a role to play as well?
I think it's a shared responsibility. Utility companies obviously need to do their part to minimize the risks, but communities and individuals also need to take steps to protect themselves and their property. This includes things like creating what we call defensible space around homes, having evacuation plans in place, and just being aware of fire weather conditions.
Right. So it's about everyone doing their part to create this culture of fire safety. So where do we go from here? What are the key takeaways from these fires, and what can we learn from them to prevent future tragedies?
I think the most important takeaway is that we really need to take a proactive approach to addressing this whole wildfire crisis in California, and it needs to be multifaceted. This includes tackling climate change head-on, improving our forest management practices, and holding these utility companies accountable for the safety of their infrastructure. We just can't afford to wait for another disaster to happen before we take action.
Right. And these fires also really underscore the importance of community preparedness and individual responsibility. We all need to be aware of the risks, take steps to protect ourselves, and work together to build more resilient communities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, and we all have a role to play in mitigating the risks and creating a safer future for California.
Well, this has been such an insightful conversation. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the potential long-term impacts of these fires? Do you think they'll lead to any significant changes in policy or regulations?
I think it's highly likely that these fires will lead to some pretty significant policy changes. We're already seeing increased pressure on utility companies to invest in these safety upgrades, and there's a growing push for stricter regulations, regarding things like vegetation management and power line maintenance.
Okay, and what about the impact on communities? Do you think these fires will lead to any long-term shifts in, how people think about wildfire risk and preparedness?
I do. I think these fires will serve as a very stark reminder of the very real threat that wildfires pose to communities all throughout California. We're likely to see a renewed focus on community-based fire prevention and mitigation efforts, as well as an increased demand for resources and support for those who have been impacted by these events.
So it's encouraging to hear that these fires might lead to some positive changes, but it's also heartbreaking to think about the toll they've already taken.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a delicate balance between acknowledging the devastation and, looking for those opportunities to learn and grow from these types of tragedies.
Okay, well, this has been a truly deep dive into a complex and incredibly important issue. I know I've learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope our listeners have too.
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you. Speaking of community action, let's maybe explore what steps residents like yourself can actually take.
You mentioned earlier that it's kind of a shared responsibility when it comes to preventing these kinds of disasters. So what can, communities, like the people listening right now, what can they actually do to push for change and make a difference in reducing the risk of these catastrophic fires?
Well, I think a great first step is just staying informed.
Yeah.
Making sure you understand the specific fire risks in your area, and then advocate for those stronger safety regulations. Contact your elected officials, attend public hearings, things like that. Make your voice heard on these issues like, power line safety and vegetation management. Those things can really make a difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. But sometimes it feels like, David and Goliath. What can one person really do to influence these big corporations and all these, complicated regulatory processes?
I hear you. And that's where collective action really comes in. Community groups, homeowner associations, all kinds of environmental organizations, banding together and working as a group can really amplify your impact. There's strength in numbers, right? It's much harder to ignore a unified voice.
So what are some concrete actions that, community groups can take? What does that, unified voice actually sound like?
Well, you can demand more transparency from the utility companies about their safety protocols, how they're actually upgrading their infrastructure, push for stricter enforcement of the existing regulations, advocate for new policies that prioritize fire safety. You can even organize public forums to educate residents about the risks and empower them to take action.
So it's about holding these companies accountable and not just accepting things the way they are. Are there any examples of communities that have actually done this, pushed for these changes, and seen results?
Definitely. There are some communities that have negotiated agreements with utility companies to bury power lines underground, especially in those high-risk fire zones. It's expensive, sure, but it significantly reduces the risk of sparks igniting those fires. Other communities have implemented much stricter building codes that require fire-resistant materials and landscaping practices to create defensible space around homes. It's really encouraging to see these types of proactive measures being taken.
So it sounds like there's a real opportunity for communities to kind of take ownership of this issue and not just wait for something bad to happen.
Exactly. It's about shifting from this reactive approach to a proactive one. Prevention is absolutely key when it comes to these wildfires.
And that brings us to our final thought for today, given what we've talked about this link between power lines and these wildfires. What steps do you think, our listeners, what steps do you think their communities should be taking to push for those safety improvements? Are there any local organizations working on wildfire prevention that you could get involved with? What resources are available in your area? These are all questions we're thinking about. It's easy to feel powerless when you're dealing with these massive challenges, But we can all make a difference here.
I agree. Even small actions, like staying informed, raising awareness, advocating for change, those can have a ripple effect. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and we all have a role to play in creating a safer future.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the January 2025 wildfires and this whole complex issue surrounding utility companies and wildfire prevention. We hope you've learned some valuable insights from this episode and feel inspired to take action in your own community. And as always, stay safe out there.